is all yours.
Thank you, Kyle. And thank you again all for coming here. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. So most of my work these days is on cities in the developing world, thinking about problems of water, thinking about using visual recognition techniques to make the previously unseeable seen to all of us. But I still dabble in the United States, and I'm going to talk about a paper that I'm currently writing together with Larry Summers and a graduate student, Ben Austin, on non-employment in the US. So this is a chart of what's happened to non-employment over the last 50 years. So when I was born in 1967, less than 1 in 20 prime-aged males were jobless. That number rose to over 20% during the Great Recession before dipping down slightly. And I think it's important, by way of background, that non-employment is a considerably worse scourge than simply being a little bit poorer. When we look at almost any reasonable metric of human well-being, whether it's suicide rates or questions about human misery or divorce rates or anything you want, joblessness tends to be absolutely terrible. Now, I do want to stress I'm going to be focusing on male non-employment here, not because we don't care about instances of female non-employment, but because it's more complicated. Because, in fact, during much of this period, female employment was rising and then declined. And there are plenty of women who choose to be jobless voluntarily, and it's not a problem. However, I'm at least going to take the view that prime-age male joblessness is pretty much universally an issue. Now, this is not a uniform pattern across the US. And where I want to take you next is into the geography of despair, the geography of joblessness across the US. And it's not going to be primarily focused on cities. It's going to be more of a regional discussion. But when you look at a map of the United States, right, it's clear that this thing is not universal. There are parts of the US, Kentucky, West Virginia, Mississippi, where jobless rates are often over 20% for prime-age males. And there are parts of the US, you can see most visibly here, the central Midwest, where joblessness is at less than 12%. This is the same thing in terms of changes. So the dark red ones have had growth in prime-age male joblessness of over 12% between 1978 and 2015. The lighter areas have had almost none, right? So an enormous gap in here. Now, this of course correlates with education, and I will come back to that, but this is a map of education in the United States. So the coastal areas, the highly urban areas, Massachusetts, downstate New York, Connecticut, Maryland, Virginia, are the most well-educated parts of America, as well as if we split California, you would see the coastal part of California is also among the best educated parts of America. And then of course this area, the region of despair, are the least educated parts of America. Prime-aged male education, typically less than 25%, often less than 15%. I often believe that the destiny of people, of cities, of regions, of countries rests on their human capital, and I think that's by and large true. Now, accompanying this scourge of joblessness has been this remarkable rise of opioid deaths in the US. I'm just going to show you a map of that. The epicenter for that early on was right here, was in Appalachia, was in the jobless belt over here, and then also other areas where joblessness is high down here as well. This is disability insurance. The largest correlate, which I'll show you later, the largest correlate of the rise in opioid deaths in the US was the share of the population in the county that was on disability 20 years ago. In many cases, people start on opioids because they have some sort of physical pain, and opioids increasingly became diagnosed as being the appropriate response. So you can see disability is at its highest here in eastern Kentucky, western West Virginia, also New Mexico, Oklahoma, and so forth. These are also the parts of America typically which have been the largest beneficiaries of welfare aid. I know to any European in the audience, America always seems like it's a skinflint in terms of its federal government expenditures, and perhaps that's true. But these areas, this sort of eastern heartland of the US, are the places where Kentucky is over $12,000 in terms of per capita federal government assistance in these areas. The darker areas down here between 10,500 and 12,000. So they're significant numbers as well, whereas the far west has much less. This is federal spending as a share of state economic activity. So in these areas, the federal government spending is between 27 and 42% of state GDP. So these are really big numbers in terms of the welfare state. Now, I'm going to parcel America up into 3 regions, and they're not 3 regions that I ever really naturally thought about, and they may not naturally be ones that occurred to you, but they actually go together One region are the coasts, which I've defined purely spatially as being the areas which are bordering on the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. These are areas which are highly urban. They tend to be relatively successful parts of America. They're the most globally connected parts of the US. And you will not be surprised that generally they look pretty good. Then I'm going to split up the interior states, the so-called flyover states, into two groups. One of which is what we'll call the Eastern Heartland, which are these dark states, and these are the Western Heartland. Now, in this case, I did not follow an exact geographic split, in part because I think age rather than space is the larger determinant of these areas. The way I did the split is whether or not these areas were states in the Union as of the year 1840. So the Western Heartland are in areas that were not states as of 1840. The Eastern Heartland all were places that were states as of 1840. And now we can look at what has happened to these three mega regions of the United States. So first, we're just showing the employment rate, which is where we started. And this is the share that were employed in the past 12 months. So this is a lower number than the non-employment rate at any point. It's a higher number, meaning the jobless rate is lower, because we're asking, did you have any job in the last 12 months at all? So as of 1980, the Western Heartland was the highest. Almost 97% of the prime age males had some kind of a job in the last year. That has declined steadily, but it's still over 90%, somewhere around 91% right now. Originally, the Eastern Heartland and the coast looked more or less the same. And I can tell you, I remember New York in 1977. It didn't seem very different from Detroit in those years. It didn't seem very different from Cleveland. It seemed like it was, yes, in many ways it was worse. Notice the separation that has occurred on this. It's not huge, but the coastal states are at 88%. The Eastern Heartland is at 86% or so. In GDP growth, the separation is much starker. So this is growth since 1978 in percentages. The Western Heartland and the coastal states have both increased by about 200%. So both of these areas are relatively economically dynamic. The Eastern Heartland has grown by less than 100%. So really a huge gap. Now, this is total GDP growth, and it combines two separate things, which I'll show you in a second, which is the Western Heartland is growing more in terms of population. The coastal states are growing more in terms of per capita GDP. The Eastern Heartland is growing in terms of neither, okay, relative to these areas. The Western Heartland has actually been the most optimistic area for manufacturing GDP growth in the United States. So this is an area which, to the extent to which the US has been dynamic in terms of manufacturing, it has been in the Western Heartland of the United States. Growth 150%. The coastal states have done, in the middle, perhaps closer to the Eastern Heartland, but at about 70%, and the Eastern Heartland has done the worst along these. GDP per worker. Okay, so this is what I was saying in terms of population versus GDP per worker. GDP per worker, the coastal states are way out ahead. Western Heartland is slightly above the Eastern Heartland, but they're both lower. Gosh, that axis is hard to read. But the GDP per worker is significantly higher in the coastal states. Working population growth, and this is how we got to the total GDP growing by about the same rates. The working population growth is faster in the Western Heartland, in the middle in the coastal states, and of course much lower in the Eastern Heartland as well. This is a fact that Ann Case and Angus Deaton made much of 2 years ago, which is the reversal in terms of mortality gains for prime-aged males. Okay? It's one of the most startling facts in the US, the fact that we've ceased getting healthier in terms of people with demographics like myself. But as you'll notice, this is most strongly prevalent in the Eastern Heartland. Now, the Western Heartland started healthier, and it also kind of leveled off. The coastal states actually reversed in the 1980s and then went down in the 1990s. That's pretty clearly related to AIDS. Okay, so that these are areas in which these mortality rates are not huge. We're talking about 25 to 55-year-olds, so it's not young people dying. It's not the very elderly dying. So a contagious disease like AIDS can really show up in these statistics. But there's a significant gulf that's widened up between the Eastern Heartland and the coastal states. And finally, I'll show you this opioid death thing, which seems threatening to be another mortality scourge akin to AIDS. This is the share with non-medical use of pain relievers in 2002, 2003, and this is the opioid deaths 2011, 2013. Here I've just done it at the state level. You can see that West Virginia is the outlier in this. It's the highest point. Kentucky is New Mexico, Nevada. These are the areas. So I have a simple model, as I've always had, of regional and national success, which emphasizes some combination of education and economic institutions. I've always thought that, when you think about the US and Europe, what the social democracies of Western Europe do much better than the US is education and education for all. Their rules are probably a little less business friendly than some parts of the US. The US tends to be quite business friendly, but doesn't do a great job, particularly of educating the bottom half or the bottom 2/3 of the country. When taken within the US, education was actually highest in the far west. Remember, it was Iowa that was the birthplace of the American high school movement. You had wealthy farmers who invested in schools partially because they knew their kids weren't going to be farmers as well, and also because their kids had a lower opportunity cost of time. They could go to school during the off season. Schools were rarest in the industrial cities. Those kids could work in factories. The industrial companies had little interest in funding schools that would provide alternative opportunities for their kids. And those education gulfs are important. The second thing that's going on is right-to-work states and rent extraction more generally, taking sort of a Mansur-Olson view that rent extraction accretes gradually in growing areas. Post-World War II, as we know from the work of Tom Holmes, those counties that were in right-to-work states had much faster growth than those counties that were not. Being relatively pro-business rather than relatively pro-union had a huge impact on which areas grew more quickly versus less quickly. Now again, this is not a statement about what you want in terms of national policy, but it just reminds us that having local policies that try to redistribute or try to tax business is costly in terms of where business decides to locate. So with that framework, what went wrong with the Eastern Heartland? I think the right view is it's a combination of low education and poor governance. Okay? And the two things connect with each other. I do believe in Thomas Jefferson's famous line that if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So this is a view that education itself is an input into the quality of government. Limited political competition in the one-party South enabled corruption, both during the era of democratic supremacy through the 1960s and then the era of Republican supremacy through this present day. And in this view, the West benefits by being newer, by not having the accretion of rent-seeking institutions that bedeviled the Eastern Heartland, and the coast benefited from the ability to reinvent itself, the ability to come to new organizations. And let me just show you the sort of education model writ small. So this is Kentucky. So if you want a part of extremes, Kentucky actually just switched from being a non-right-to-work state to being a right-to-work state, and we'll see what happens from that. Kentucky has an area centered around Louisville that is actually reasonably well-educated and reasonably prosperous. The dots show the level of income, and they have an area that is certainly among the least educated and among the least prosperous parts of the entire United States, right? And both of these exist within one area, and they go together very closely. They are also associated with this enormous mortality gap. So, 10-year gap within a state, within an hour's drive, a 10-year mortality gap. It's an astonishing amount of heterogeneity within space within the United States. One last point on just showing things about the education that would seem to support this. So this is the share of college educated in percent in 1978 through today. In 1978, the coastal states in the Western Heartland were about equivalently educated, and they were much more educated than the Eastern Heartland. Over time, the Eastern Heartland has actually caught up a little bit, certainly to the Western Heartland. The Western Heartland has been the most stagnant, and it's the coastal states that have increased most. And this reflects the enormous allure that highly educated cities have had for other highly educated people, right? The great sorting that's happened within the United States. I wonder, looking at this, whether or not we can currently look at the Western Heartland and think it's reasonably healthy, but whether or not it will remain so in the future going on. Just showing you a little bit on the rules side of the rules in schools mantra. These are two measures. I'm going to give you just two maps of political issues. This is corruption, and corruption is typically measured at the state level by federal charges for corruption against localities. So you can't look at local charges ever, because a truly corrupt machine will never charge itself. So you have to look at what's happening in terms of the federal level. This came from a paper. This itself is borrowed from a map from you and Mikesell, but my own work on this dates back to 2005 with a paper with Raven Sachs. And these are the most corrupt states are those in the Eastern Heartland, and they're more corrupt in the South than they are in the North typically. This is the rules side of this. So this is one of the sort of crazy forms of overregulation that America is increasingly prone to. It's not just about building controls, it's also about occupational licensing. This is opticians. Now, opticians are not actually doctors. Opticians are the guys who actually sell you your glasses. So if you think about what an optician could do wrong, they can sell you a pair of round glasses when you actually need a square pair of one, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that they can get wrong. And yet we've seen an increasing number of areas licensing them, and certainly reasonable people like John Haltwanger, who's been very big on emphasizing the reduction in entrepreneurship in the US, has argued that increasing waves of occupational licensing have played a role in this. Just to remind you what's been happening in terms of employment is not necessarily about an end for traditional industries. So this is coal mining in Kentucky. The blue line is production, which is kind of static, right? The red line is employment, okay? So it's exactly a model in which it's not that America is ceasing to mine or to manufacture, but it just doesn't need bodies to do it anymore. And it's why when you think about sort of manufacturing-related policies, you can very well manufacture in the US, but it's just not obvious when that's ever going to lead to employment, particularly of less skilled workers. So let me just end by throwing out to you what the challenge is, right? So we have these regional pockets of the US that are hugely problematic. Does this mean that we should revisit the old place versus people-based policies? The Economist had a cover story on this 2 weeks ago. And that's really what Larry and I are grappling with right now. I've traditionally always taken the strong economics line that you support people, not places, that what West Virginia and Kentucky need is better schools for their kids, investing in education for the very young, and I still hold to that. But the question is, should we do more? In the context of Boston, I'm fairly convinced that it's worthwhile experimenting with entrepreneurship zones. And by this I mean not zones in which you redistribute, but zones in which you have, let's say, one-stop permitting for businesses, right? One of the crimes in the US is that we regulate rich person entrepreneurship much more lightly than we regulate poor person entrepreneurship. If you want to start an internet startup over there in Kendall Square, you will go through no zoning permits to go do it. You will have no regulations at all. If you want to start a bodega, right, in the same location, you will have 17 permits to work through. So one idea was to have entrepreneurship zones which are essentially fast-tracking immigrant businesses or other businesses for this. But it's harder to imagine doing this for a large-scale region. And indeed, we had an Appalachian policy since the 1960s. We built all these highways. We had an Appalachian Regional Commission. I think my view, and this comes from a paper of mine about 10 years ago looking at the impact of being in the ARC, was there was a little bit of bump up in the 1970s for being an ARC county versus a non-ARC county. After 1980, that pretty much completely disappeared. And so the question is, if we are going to have regional policies, will they actually make a difference? And also, do we want to actually subsidize people to live in areas that are declining? This is a map from, this is Gallup data on the states where people say they'd like to move states, right? So the darker green are higher rates of people saying they'd like to live somewhere else than where they're currently living. Illinois does very well in this, but you can see a lot of these eastern heartland places show very high numbers. So the question is, and I'll bring it back to Peter here, should we be thinking about the right policy not necessarily as being place-based in the declining regions, but place-based in the growing regions? Should we be thinking about how to make Silicon Valley more accepting of people who want to move in? Should we be thinking about how to make Boston more accepting of people who want to move in? And that, of course, takes me back to housing policies. Over the past 20 years in the US, so this is 1996 to 2012, but it would be true if I scaled it forward, pretty much all of the population growth, pretty much all of the housing price growth, and this comes from FHFA, repeat sales indices, has been in the metropolitan areas with the highest density levels. Within metropolitan areas, the price growth has been skewed much more strongly towards the city centers rather than the edges. Okay, so this is the growth from 97 to 2015 using Zillow sub-city data. Again, huge growth. And this is a combination of demand for urban spaces, and this is exactly what Peter was talking about, coupled with strong supply restrictions, right? It's an amazing thing. This is density and income within Manhattan. And there's a lot of selection as well as treatment there. But certainly what I've seen over the last 20 years has been this huge favor for dense, highly educated people in terms of productivity. So throughout American history, right, people have traditionally moved to areas that are more productive. I mean, the normal American way to deal with the poverty of a region is to get out, right? I had ancestors who lived in Kentucky 200 years ago. They didn't stay there very long. My great-grandfather left Pittsburgh in 1930 to move to the New York metropolitan area. That is a traditional American response to decline. We are a very mobile population. We've become much less mobile. And it's hard not to think that this has something to do with it. That whereas in the 19th century, we built up Chicago at an astonishing rate, adding hundreds of thousands of homes. We built 100,000 homes a year in New York in the early 1920s, providing space for people like my great-grandfather when he came there, right? We no longer do that. And it really raises, this is a map which says permits issued between 2000 and 2013 over the original housing stock, and this is the relationship between price and marginal physical cost of construction. We no longer do this. So, you can't move, if you're a medium income person, you can't move to a city like San Francisco because the housing is too expensive, because we have zoned out opportunity. because we've zoned out the creation of housing that would enable people to move in. So I'm throwing this out both because I think that it's important that we have a discussion about what place-based policies we genuinely believe in, what things we actually think work for declining regions like the Eastern Heartland, and also at the same time what we should be thinking about in terms of making sure that the places that are succeeding can be welcoming, can be engines of opportunity for people who come there. And with that, I'll hand it over to Saskia.